What is wrong usually with the PR for startups?
You need to think in terms of what the media outlet is seeking to do.
There is no sense actually to contact editors.
Often the best way is to ring up the publication and ask who to speak to, and ask who you should send an email to or who you should call.
Would you, as a journalist receiving this templated email, be satisfied?
For each individual journalist that you contact, personalize it to a degree. Write a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of the email saying exactly why you are getting in contact.
But you are talking about building relationships, so it is a different approach, and it makes me think that maybe press release is even not necessary.
So I wouldn't say that press releases are beside the point. They can be a good way of introducing a company, but they're aside from news pages, they aren't always something that will be immediately of interest to the release itself, if you like, the contents of the release itself.
Trevor, how many requests or press releases do you receive weekly or monthly?
I should have counted actually before I came on to do this interview.
Good day to everyone. This is InnMind channel with the best first-hand information for startup founders and tech entrepreneurs. And today, this is a really special New Year edition, the first one in 2021, where we want to touch an incredibly important topic, the topic of PR for startups. It is incredibly important additionally because every second or not the first founder fails with the PR efforts, and we receive a lot of requests, questions from founders on how to get featured in media and how to get in touch with journalists. And today we invited an amazing guest from UK, Trevor Clawson, who is a freelance journalist, blogger, author, and very experienced person focusing specifically on the topic of technology, business, SMEs, startups, etc., working for Forbes, Guardian, Times, Sunday Times, and many other super important and recognized media outlets. So, hello, Trevor.
Hello, and thanks for having me along. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for taking time and being willing to answer the questions. So my first question is actually, can you please give some hint on what do you see from the journalist perspective? What is wrong usually with the PR for startups when they are making PR efforts and trying to reach you out, asking to write about them?
Well, the first thing I would say is just to make a general observation, is that as a journalist, you're looking for something which will enhance the knowledge of your readers. You're writing for a certain audience, you're writing for a certain set of readers. And what you want from the people you interview is the information that will be useful to those readers. Flipping that over to the perspective of a startup seeking coverage for the first time, obviously what you want is some profile. You want some column inches. You want a few minutes on radio or on TV or on the internet. So journalist and startup are looking at things from two different perspectives, but hopefully you can meet in the middle. And I guess what the journalist is really looking for, and everyone approaches the craft a little bit differently, is something that will be of interest to his or her readers. And I think that's something that startups should always bear in mind, that you need to think in terms of the media outlet, whether it's a magazine, whether it's an online site, whether it's a YouTube channel, whether it's a newspaper. You need to think in terms of what the media outlet is seeking to do, and the audience that it's seeking to reach. And you also need to think in terms of the journalist and what he or she writes about regularly, what interests them. And very often the first thing that goes wrong is you just get an email or a phone call saying, hey, we're a great company, we do this, can you cover us? And that's not helpful. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not annoying from a journalist's point of view, but it isn't helpful. It doesn't help you get a feel for what the company does and why you should write about them or why you should cover them. So I think the first thing I would say is it's always good to start from the perspective of what the media outlet is seeking to do. They're not really there to cover your startup, but they will want to if the startup has something interesting to say. And I think that would be the first point I would make. And that sort of leads on to research, I guess. I think the first step for any startup seeking coverage is to research the market, research the publications, but also research the journalists, and that can take a little bit of time, I know. But if you do that, then what you find yourself doing is tailoring your pitches to the specific needs of a publication or the specific needs or interests of a journalist, and you're much more likely to succeed if you take that approach rather than simply a scattergun approach where you send an email to everybody and say, we're a great company, give us some coverage. So I think research is the thing that's often lacking, but it is really, really important.
Oh, Trevor, that's very good point. So they should make a kind of homework before the first contact, reading the articles, understanding what are the key points and topics he or she covers, and only then starting cold emailing, pointing out the interests of this particular journalist.
I think that's absolutely true, and it does require a bit of homework, and it does require a bit of work, and we could go on perhaps a little bit later when we talk about the role of PR companies, but ways of reducing that work in terms of the founders. But to take an example, the work that I do for Forbes.com, I write for the entrepreneur channel of Forbes.com on a regular basis. And I write a lot about tech companies, because that's a big thing, certainly in London and where I live. I also get a lot of pitches from IT companies who are not startups, who are not entrepreneurial companies who've been established for a long time, saying, would you like to cover this in Forbes? And I usually email back and say, no, it's an interesting story, but I only cover entrepreneurs for Forbes. And a little bit of research would have revealed to them that I'm not necessarily the journalist to approach. And that's what makes the difference. You can actually save time in the long run by understanding who you're writing to or who you're pitching to.
And for the Forbes, for example, you shouldn't be Tesla founder or Mark Zuckerberg to be featured in Forbes.
That they have got to the stage where they're probably 2 points there, really. They've got to the stage where they're probably not going to be covered by contributors to the Entrepreneur Channel because they're big corporates. The other factor would be, and it's possibly a bit harder to pull out of the, if somebody reads 5 or 6 of my pieces, I cover the UK and Europe. So if somebody was pitching a US company to me, again, I would have to say, sorry, that's done by US contributors. It's not one for me. So again, a little bit of research looking at what the writer focuses on. Likewise, if you switch that over to publications, if you work in, say, digital marketing, there are lots and lots of trade publications that specialize in digital marketing. And you could actually just approach them regardless of what stage your company is at, whether it's at very early stage. If you're doing something interesting, it's worth approaching them because that's what they're interested in. a national newspaper, to go to the other extreme, isn't necessarily going to be interested in that because it's not, they're dealing with a much more general audience. So you need to think in terms of a story that will interest a national newspaper audience rather than a trade magazine audience. So again, I think you have to research the publications and the audience they address, and then tailor your pitch accordingly.
Mm-hmm. And do you also understand correctly that there is no sense actually to contact editors? You are also an editor in some of your roles, and many people try to approach directly editors thinking that this is the fastest and more efficient way.
That's a good question, and there's no single answer to that. I've edited a number of magazines, which were actually trade magazines, and as editor and my deputy editor, we would read pitches and we would make decisions on that basis. If you go to a national newspaper, on the other hand, the editor is not the person to approach. National newspapers have a whole sort of ecosystem of commissioning editors, and it's not always obvious who they are. And they are the people you need to approach. And often the best way is to ring up the publication and ask who to speak to, and ask who you should send an email to or who you should call. And in the case of, again, say a national newspaper, they will tell you. They'll say the commissioning editor for this kind of story is so and so, and here's the email address. And it's always worth taking your research to the publication itself. Often, however, it might be better to approach a freelance journalist who writes for that particular publication, because then they can think about the story, they can think about how it would work for the publication, and then as a freelancer you can't guarantee anything, but you can pitch the story to the editor on and say, I want to write about digital marketing. There are lots of new things happening, and there are 3 companies I can speak to, and here's the way I would position the story. So it can be a good idea to speak to a freelance journalist who are always looking for ideas. But you do need, if you're approaching the publication directly, you do need to find out who commissions the stories, and that's not always easy to do. And one way is to ring up the publication or the media outlet and ask, and the other way is to use LinkedIn, and you can find out a lot from LinkedIn, just by the various ways of searching that you can use, and then you can approach people direct.
Yeah, actually, that is how I contacted you.
Thumbs up for LinkedIn on that basis. But so the short answer would be, there is no one way to approach a publication. Some of them have editors who read and receive and make decisions on the pitches. The others have a network of commissioning editors, and some of them are freelance as well. So the trick is to find out who to speak to.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And okay, so it depends case by case, and just try to approach journalists, to approach editors, and then you will see what works and what does not work. Correct?
I think so, and a lot of publications, online publications, will have a list of editors at the back, and there might be an editor-in-chief who's probably usually not the person to approach. Then maybe a deputy editor, then maybe a list of commissioning editors. So you can sometimes find out quite a lot from the website as well.
Okay, Trevor, while preparing for this interview, I was making my own research and, of course, Googling PR for startups, what kind of advice there is in the internet, and what kind of questions exist. And I was lost in the big ocean of information. I mean, it was more than 30 million of results only in Google, and 500,000 videos, etc. So many marketing people, so many experts give advice and teach other people how to make PR. They produce for free or even for money. They provide different templates for cold emails to journalists, templates, how should you pitch, etc. How do you think? Is there any sense behind, and would you, as a journalist receiving this templated email, be satisfied?
That's a very good question. I think yes and no is the answer. If you have got a lot of information to impart about your company, when it was founded, who founded it, why it was founded, all these things, you don't want to be rewriting that over and over again for each individual journalist. So you can use a template for that. You can use a boilerplate. But what I would always recommend is, and again this goes back to the research, is for each individual journalist that you contact, personalize it to a degree. Write a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of the email saying exactly why you are getting in contact. So if someone was contacting me about a particular story or a particular company, there might be a template with all detailed information about the company, but it's always helpful to have an opening paragraph explaining why this particular company or their PR company is getting in touch, why they think I would like to hear about them, and why the story is particularly relevant for my readers or the publications that I write for, or one of the publication, because that's really what I'm looking for. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps, of startup companies. Many of them are really, really good. I can't write about all of them. No one can write about all of them. But with a little bit of forethought, if I've been writing, again, to take a subject, if I've been writing a regular series of articles about blockchain technology, for example, if somebody has read any of those articles, they might see something in them and say, well, actually, we've got something to contribute to this debate. We've got something to contribute to this discussion. I'll get in touch with Trevor Clawson. I'll explain why I'm getting in touch and explain what I'd like to say and why it might be interesting. And that's always a good way to start. And that really has to be personalized, I think, to individual journalists, because, we're all a bit different and we all cover different things and we all write for a range of different publications.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to another question. In one of these best guides for PR, which I read, I've seen an advice that a kind of journalists like to save their own time. So it is better to actually send them the ready to publish story, which they can amend a little bit, but don't need to write the story from scratch. Is it correct or not really?
That's a really good question. It's not correct for me, and it never has been. I think there are a number of ways to look at that. If you're thinking in terms of news, if you're thinking in terms of a news item as opposed to, say, an analytical piece or an interview-led piece, very often that can be the case. And when I was editing magazines, we would have a small, because they were monthly magazines, so you didn't really do news, but we would have a small 2-3 page news section. And very often in those cases, a press release would come in and there wouldn't really be much to add. It might be something like, a company has just raised 3 million in Series A funding. So there's not an awful lot to add to that story. So you could more or less use the press release to put that on the news page. The type of story I'm a freelancer, so I tend to write feature articles, or I'll write blogs for Forbes, and the aim there is to add a bit of value or to add a bit of analysis. And I'm not really interested in just receiving a pre-written story. People send me a lot of them, actually, and I always write back and say, I'm a writer, not an editor. I don't really have any need for this. So I would say that, and again, there are two homes for pre-written stories. One is news pages, where it's a news item, and the other is a lot of magazines, particularly, will take contributed articles. So they'll take them from industry experts, and they won't pay for them because it's PR, and they'll maybe 5% of the magazine will feature contributed stories. You would send those to the editor, and you would say, "Look, I'm an expert in blockchain, or I'm an expert in floating companies, and I've got a really interesting take on why 60% of companies get their flotations wrong, and I'll provide you with a 1,000-word article on that." And an editor might well say, "Yep, that's fine. We'll run that. We like that." As a freelance writer, I'm not interested in that sort of story. I'm much more interested in stories that I can get my teeth into, and where I can interview a founder or interview a couple of founders, and actually find a story there rather than just a PR message, if you like. So I would say, for me, no, definitely don't send me pre-written stories. But you can find a home for them. And normally it's in trade magazines. Normally it's in magazines where they set aside a percentage of the magazine for contributed stories.
Mm-hmm. So write these stories only if you want to be a columnist, or to distribute it directly on your own name in the magazine or newspaper, but don't write on behalf of journalists.
I would say that, yes.
On behalf of good journalists, let's say so.
My view would be, as a journalist, you should write your own stories, and because otherwise, what's the point, really? And yes, in terms of when you move away from news, when you look at contributed pieces, they should be bylined by an author. Such and such from Acme Blockchain is writing about this, and in that way, it's there. You're sharing your knowledge of the industry. You've got your byline on the story, and the editor is happy because they've got a bit of expert knowledge. So that'd be my rule of thumb.
And speaking about the story itself, actually, if I understand correctly, every journalist is seeking for some unique content, some exclusive news, exclusive information. But on another side, every entrepreneur wants to be featured in as many magazines as possible. And then there is some chicken and egg problem, or some collapse, because entrepreneurs, sometimes they need to wait weeks or maybe even months until you finally decide, or editor finally decides to publish this story or not. Should they make only one exclusive story sent to only one journalist and then wait, or can they somehow multiply the efforts?
I think you should probably multiply your efforts. Actually, I do get pitches from PR companies, mainly, not usually directly from companies, who say we'll offer you this as an exclusive. And in all honesty, I don't really mind if it's an exclusive or not. I don't really mind if it's going out to other freelancers. Because, and the reason for that is that if I write something, say for Forbes, I would like to think nobody else is going to cover that story for Forbes. But if somebody covers it in the same story in the Times, or somebody covers the same story in a trade publication, that is going out to different readers. It's being read by different people, and it's being written by different journalists. And each journalist may do something completely different with it. You could approach me with a story about a company that has, I don't know, started off importing coffee and selling it to cafes around the country, independent coffee. COVID comes along, they don't have an audience anymore, they don't have a market from cafes anymore. So instead they pivot to being a mail order business. Now you could I could pick that up, because the really interesting thing would be the pivot in the business. They've faced a real challenge and they've pivoted. Another journalist could actually think the really interesting thing is, they might be writing a piece on fair trade coffee, and that story could come in and they'd say, well, I've interviewed 2 other coffee companies about fair trade coffee, and this will add a 3rd interview to my piece. So journalists will use the same source material in different ways, and they might not use it immediately. One journalist might profile the company, another might write a feature article about the coffee industry, another might profile the entrepreneur who might have had 3 or 4 previous companies, and they've all been different, so that would be a different angle on the story. So I would say, get your message out to as many journalists as possible. Don't necessarily think in terms of exclusives, because journalists will find something. Different journalists will find different aspects of your company's story interesting, and they'll use them in different ways. So I don't think it's necessary to offer exclusives, really, unless it's such a big story that you really want it, as a journalist, you really want it to be a scoop. You really want it to be, nobody else has heard this piece of information. A small company is a small artificial intelligence company is about to be bought by Google, and you're being offered it as an exclusive story. Yeah, then you would want that to be an exclusive if it is offered as such. But in most cases, you're sifting through information as a journalist. You're not necessarily looking all the time for scoops and exclusive scoops.
And then maybe there is a difference also between the news journalists, the investigation journalism, and the storytelling journalism, if I can name it so, yes?
Absolutely. There is a difference. And again, this gets back to the whole aspect of research. And I suggested you research publications and you research freelance journalists. But once you target certain publications, you should also be looking at what goes on inside them. And if you're looking at, and maybe this is old hat in the modern world, but it's not really, people still like them. If you look at a magazine, typically there will be a news section. Following that, there will be some short, possibly analytical pieces based on the news, but focusing more on analysis. Then there will be 2 or 3 major features. One of them might be an in-depth interview with an entrepreneur. Another might be a feature that involves 6 or 7 interviews with different entrepreneurs on a specific topic, such as raising money or floating on the stock market or something like that. And a third piece might be look at a sort of specific topic that's hot within an industry at any one time. So if you look at marketing, the third piece might be looking at sort of how we have influencers on YouTube, but in China they have live streaming where the stream is linked directly to e-commerce sales, and that's beginning to happen in Europe. So you might have a feature on that specific market development. And then towards the end of the magazine, you tend to have lighter features as well. You might have, very often the back page is semi-humorous or somebody's very individualistic take on on the market. So in doing your research, you need to look at the magazine or the publication and the different types of articles that they publish. And then you maybe have to think in terms of what you as a company have to offer. Very often that won't be necessarily about a huge focus on your company. It might be expertise. And again, if we go back to that possible topic of live streaming, it might be that you run a European company that is moving into the live streaming market. You've done all the research, and you would have something to say on that. So it wouldn't necessarily be a profile of your company that appears, but the CEO or the chief marketing officer would be providing insights. Rather than talking about the company, it would be talking about the market. So again, there are all sorts of ways to get your company into a publication, and it's not just about company profiles. Very often, it's about expertise. It's about the insights that you can provide, and both are equally valuable, actually, because people very often think that I got interviewed by a journalist, 3 weeks ago, and when the article came out, it was 2,000 words long, and I only had 3 quotes in it, which were 2 lines each. Was there really any point in talking to that journalist? Probably there was, particularly if it's a major publication, because the very fact that you've been chosen by a journalist to comment on a particular market does set you up as an expert. It does set you up as someone who understands the market, who has something to say, who has a bit of thought leadership to add. And that's very often as valuable as, say, a 600-word company profile, which is all about you. But it won't necessarily be of too much interest to people who don't know your company already. So in some ways, I think it's always good to look at a whole range of ways that you can contribute. And it gets back to that point that the journalist is looking for something that will be interesting to his or her audience. And there are lots of ways that businesses can contribute to that, often by expertise, often by the experience they've had. To take a bad example, a journalist might be writing about how companies turn around after staring bankruptcy in the face. If you're a company boss who's done that, and you're prepared to talk about it, you're prepared to talk about the hard decisions that are necessary to actually turn a company that's failing into a company that's succeeding, then that's great, because you're providing something that's of huge interest to other people, because there are a lot of business owners who face really difficult times. So in that respect, I think another thing I would say is that after an initial pitch to journalists, it's always worth keeping an eye on what they're doing, getting in touch, asking them, are they working on any particular stories that are relevant to your industry or your experience, and offering to contribute to those, rather than just saying, I've got a great company, write about me. I think it's always worth developing relationships, and then very often what happens is a journalist will be writing about something. Let's take that company turnaround story, and they'll say, oh yeah. I got contacted about this about 3 or 4 weeks ago. That guy had something really interesting to say. I'll ring him up and see if he wants to do an interview. So the building relationships, I think, is important as well, and perhaps not expecting all the time an instant result, where the journalist says, "Oh yeah, I'll run this story next week." Might be 2, 3 weeks, 4 months, a year, and the journalist will get back to you. So I've rambled on a bit about this, but I guess the core point is that understand the different sorts of articles that get written, and try and understand how you as an individual, as a company owner, can feed into that, the various things that a publication does, whether it's company profiles or whether it's topic-led articles.
That's a very interesting point. So guys who are listening us or watching us now are building a relationship. It's about relationship and not about one-way road where you just send your press release and hope, cross your fingers, that out of thousands of recipients, one or two will publish it. It's about discussion, interaction, listening not only to yourself by the journalist, but also to listening to the journalist and understanding what does he or she need from you, actually, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And you might trigger a story as well. I think this is important to say. Talking from a UK perspective, somebody contacted me not so long ago, 3 or 4 months ago, I think, and they were talking about their worries or their concerns about, how you export to Europe from the UK post Brexit. Now that in itself is interesting, and it can be a trigger for a story, because then you could think, well, yeah, I can talk to the company that has just contacted me, but also I could talk to 2 or 3 other companies ahead of Brexit and find out how they're preparing for what has just happened, unfortunately, in my view. And then you get a feature article out of that, which is initially triggered by somebody getting in touch and saying, might be that we're preparing for Brexit by doing this, or it might be saying, we're providing a service for companies to help them deal with all the new customs regulations. And what comes out of that is a longer feature and a more in-depth feature about the problems that are potentially facing British companies, and some of the solutions as well, some of the potential solutions. So I think companies can also look at, I suppose, to put it in a nutshell, maybe if it's relevant, you can look at the news agenda, what's happening, whether it's COVID, whether it's Brexit, whether it's global warming, climate change, all these things that are going to be driving business over the next sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if you have a product, or if you have some kind of offer, if you've got an insight about that, you don't have to necessarily approach a journalist and say, again, I've got a great company, please write about me. You can say, well, it's the COP26 climate change summit in 6 months' time or 8 months' time, and we're one of many startups that are actually offering new solutions. If you're writing about this subject, please consider us, because we do have something to say. And that helps build relationships, and that, I think most journalists, whether they do it by writing it all down, or whether they have some sort of card filing system, which I must admit I don't, or whether they just keep things in their heads, which tends to be my method, will remember initial contacts, and they will, and the story comes up, and you think, oh, I need people to interview. That company got in touch 3 months ago, and they sounded good. They would be ideal for the feature I'm about to write. So it is really about relationship building, and it's not necessarily a simple thing.
Oh, seriously? So you keep all these in your mind, and then you can remind, when you have a story, even half a year later, you can remind the initial contact. So actually, it is not needed to wait until some really you have new feature or important news to share. You can just contact journalists in between for future relationship.
You can do that, and if you can tie it into to something that is in the news agenda at the moment, or is going to be in the news agenda, that's really, really good, I think. and again, to take an example, again, of COP26 and the climate summit that's going to take place in Glasgow it's November, I think that's happening. Around about that stage, newspapers, magazines are going to be absolutely full of climate change related stories and zero carbon stories. Maybe now is the time, or maybe sort of April, March, to actually begin to feed into that, because very often stories are written 2 or 3 months ahead of the event anyway, because we know that the zero carbon agenda is going to be the center of the headlines in 8 months' time. So you can begin, if you're working in that field, you can begin to build the relationships as we speak, and you can begin to establish contacts with journalists who might be writing about it, find out who might be writing about it and who won't be, and build relationships from there. Which does sound like a lot of work, but I think it can pay off. And sometimes it is just but sometimes it is as simple as you receive a press release about a particular subject, and let's stay on zero carbon for a minute. You receive a press release about maybe a company who's using Internet of Things technology to monitor emissions, and you think, well, that's really interesting. It doesn't tie in with what I'm doing at the moment. But the fact you've found it really interesting as a journalist means that you're much more likely to get in contact in 3 months' time when you are writing about that, because that's the point at which you will be looking for interesting people to speak to. So I would say nothing is wasted. And again, this gets back to the different types of stories, that very often the best coverage for a company is not so much the company profile, but it is where they do have something really interesting to say in a bigger article, and there's thought leadership there, and that very often depends on either building relations or sending out good press releases, which get stored away in the journalist's mind and get used at a later date.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about press releases, actually, this is also not very clear what to do with them and if they are necessary at all, because it is a kind of cliche in everyone's mind that if you contact journalists, you should have a press release. If you have a press release, it should have some news about some new features, some big announcement or whatever. But you are talking about building relationships, so it is a different approach, and it makes me think that maybe press release is even not necessary.
I think that a press release can be the first stage in putting yourself onto the radar screen of a journalist, and you could couch that as relationship building. To take an example, I get lots and lots of press releases about fundraising. So I'll get a lot of releases about we've raised so much in Series A or Series B or whatever, and I can't really use those because I don't cover fundraising events. I don't. What I might be able to do is look at the company behind that fundraising if they're doing something really interesting. So the press release itself will tell me company X has raised €3 million to do this. And that in itself to me, is not particularly interesting, but it will be interesting to some news editors on some publications. But at that point, I do know what company X does for the first time. And if company X is doing something really interesting, then again, I can file that away mentally and maybe get back to them if I feel they could contribute to it might even be they could contribute to a bigger piece on effective ways to raise funding, or it could be that they can contribute to a piece on developments in their sector, or it could be if they've raised that money to scale up out of Europe and into the US, it could be that in 3 months' time, I'll be writing a piece on how to break the US market. And so that press release, I'll be able to go back to them and say, well, you're doing this. You're breaking into the US. Do you mind sort of giving me a few quotes on, on what your strategy is and, what's worked for you and what hasn't? So I wouldn't say that press releases are beside the point. They can be a good way of introducing a company, but they're aside from news pages, they aren't always something that will be immediately of interest to the release itself, if you like, the contents of the release itself. But they're a good way of introducing yourself to journalists and letting people know what you're doing as a company.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's clear. So you should have a press release.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Even without some certain news or important announcement, a press release like a CV of the company, what they are doing and what has happened recently.
It helps, I think. I mean, a release normally has to have some sort of news tag, really. That might be raising money. It might be launching into the market. It might be that you've been beta testing for 6 months and you're going live. You're going properly live. So it could be that you're later in the stage. Your founder is stepping down and a new CEO is coming in. But generally, there needs to be a news tag. The news tag won't necessarily be of interest to every journalist all the time, but it is a good way of, because generally speaking, you're not just covering the news. The release will have quite a few details about the company, strategy, what they do, and that's maybe in the longer term a bit more interesting because you can, assuming as a journalist you have time to read the release and go through it. It adds to your list of contacts. It adds to the list of people that who can be contacted and comment on certain topics. So I would say press releases are good to get you onto news pages, and the more interesting, the better. Often they will have to be targeted at trade magazines rather than, say, national press, whatever. But they're good to get you onto news pages. But they're also good just in terms of raising your profile, even if you don't get a call the next day from half a dozen journalists. You might get, a call in 6 months' time or 3 months' time. So I would recommend press releases, actually. With quite a lot of information, because that's useful as well. And normally, if a PR company is working on your behalf, they will do a lot of that for you. They'll tell you not only that you need to sort of cover the news item that the release is sent out to cover, but they'll tell you what you need to say about the company itself, its background, the founders, the market that it's working in, its future strategies, and all of those things are potentially really interesting to journalists.
Mm-hmm. Trevor, how many requests or press releases do you receive weekly or monthly?
I should have counted, actually, before I came on to do this interview. At a rough estimate, I would say this month, probably until mid-January, I won't receive that many because things are still ramping up. But on an average month, I would say I probably get about between 15 and 20 press releases / pitches a day, maybe a little bit more than that. So that's it is quite a lot, and some of them, it has to be said, are so far off the mark that I'll read the opening lines, but I won't read further. And this gets back to the research aspect of things. It's a good idea to target your releases at people you think will be really, really interested in them, because even from the header line on the email, you kind of know, oh yeah, that sounds a bit interesting. But I do get a lot, and it does mean that a lot of press releases, will apparently fall by the wayside. I won't use them. But I would stress that I do read most of them, and in 3 months' time, I could well go back to a particular company and say, well, I couldn't use your release, but I'm sort of interested in what you do, and could you talk to me about about a specific topic? So target the releases, I would say, because journalists do get too many of them. But by the same token, don't feel shy about sending them, because they are a useful tool. I think they're a useful PR tool.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about PR tools, do you use yourself as a journalist a variety of platforms that make this mass sending of press releases, like PR NewsWire, I don't know, Haro, Help a Reporter, others?
Occasionally. Occasionally I will do, and because I get sent quite a few press releases, and because most of them are sent to me by PR companies that know me, and they do try and target what they send. I think most of PR companies send different releases to different journalists. I already have quite a lot to work with. And I think to sort of slightly, I'll get back to that question in a sec, but to slightly sort of go off at a tangent, what's almost even better than a press release is a PR company, it's usually PR companies who do this rather than the companies, will phone you up in advance and say, we're putting together a release on, such and such a company. We think this might be interesting. And then you have that information before everybody else does, even though the release comes 3 days later or whatever. And if your plan is to pitch to editors, then you have that. As a journalist pitch to editors, then you have that information before everybody else does as well. So again, getting back to relationships, that's quite important. Sometimes you just get the release. Sometimes you get a phone call a few days before asking, are you interested in this? When you go to the platforms like PR NewsWire, I will occasionally use that if I'm short of work and I'm looking for story ideas. I might go to some a press release platform and just read the releases and see if there's anything interesting. By that stage, though, you're probably about. A lot of other people will have done the same thing. Sometimes it is. I said it's not necessarily to be exclusive, but sometimes it's nice to have a chat with somebody before a release comes out, where you can sort of think of the original ideas to cover the story. And I find that with the platforms, I'll use them a little bit, but they're not my preferred way to work. I much prefer getting the releases with a covering note directly from either from a company or from a PR company, and the covering note might give me a clue as to why I want to cover the story as well. Because if it's a PR company, they probably know me, they know what I write about, and they'll kind of tailor it for me. Whereas on a big platform, you're just kind of looking down a whole list of things that other people will be reading at exactly the same time, and I don't. For me, and it's different for everyone. That's not a great use of time.
Okay.
I wouldn't try and deter people from sending their releases to those platforms, but I just personally, I don't use them that much.
So to summarize, if you're using them, don't put too much expectations, because some journalists, for example, news journalists, maybe hunt for this news in the platforms because they need the information every day, maybe every hour. And others, like Trevor, who are writing about stories, about deep topics, etc., they most probably will skip this part and prefer personal communication and deeper view.
I think so. That's how it works for me, and I prefer personal communication for that reason. But I wouldn't. It won't do you any harm at all to distribute your press releases as widely as possible. So I wouldn't try and dissuade people from doing that. And actually, it's a numbers game as well. If you put your press release in front of 300 journalists and somebody will probably take an interest. It's just on a personal level, it's not my way of preferred way of working.
Mm-hmm. And actually, these platforms are not so expensive. So if the startup has some small budget, they can afford them. But speaking about something way more expensive, PR companies. You mentioned a few times that you work a lot or you are contacted a lot with PR companies who know you, who make tailor-made messages, etc. But we know perfectly that majority of startups simply cannot afford. I don't know how much it costs in UK, but for example, in Switzerland, we used a few times PR companies, and the general check was like 15,000 of euros per month of work, something like that. First of all, from journalist perspective, from your seat, do you prefer to talk to PR guys or to entrepreneurs directly?
The short answer is I don't mind. I don't mind whether somebody calls me up or emails me directly, or whether it's a PR company. On both occasions, people are imparting information, and that's what I'm looking for. The slightly longer answer is that there are some advantages to PR from a journalistic point of view. There are some advantages to PR companies mediating, and some disadvantages. The advantage probably is that if it's a good PR company and they've been around a while and they're properly, they know what they're doing, and again they do for the most part what a lot of startup founders don't really have the time to do, which is that research job on publications and journalists. And after a while, the PR companies are kind of bringing up the same journalists a lot, and you sort of get to know each other, and they tend to know what journalists want, and they'll be selective. So they might say today, well, I've got this story. I think Trevor might like this one, so I'll give him a ring and see what he thinks. And they'll maybe do that with 3 or 4 other journalists. On another day, they'll have a different client, and they'll say, well, actually, that's not one for Trevor. I'll try ringing somebody else. So they build the relationships on behalf of the companies, and that's a can be a good thing. The other thing that they tend to do, which is quite useful, is they do a bit of due diligence on the companies. I don't think many PR companies take on clients unless they've had a good look at what those clients do, whether their figures stack up, for example. So if a client comes on board saying we've got revenues of 250,000 last year, that will probably be accurate. And they provide a degree of media training as well for the clients. So there is, particularly with the better, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong about this, but I think there's a degree of security that comes from talking initially to a PR company, because the PR companies will have done a bit of due diligence on the companies, and that's particularly important in areas like blockchain, where people make all sorts of outlandish claims about their blockchain products, and there aren't that many specialist blockchain journalists, so it's always helpful if you can sort of talk through issues with the PR company. The disadvantage, perhaps, from my point of view, is that almost a flip side of the other. When PR companies know what they're doing, they can sometimes over media train their clients. Their job is to get the good news out there and to represent their clients. Very often, increasingly, PR companies want to sit in on the calls as well, so that when I started doing this, which was about 20 years ago, if you interviewed someone, it was usually on the phone, and it was a one-to-one line. Nowadays, that's the exception rather than the rule. Nowadays, very often it's set up, so it's a conference call, it's a Zoom call with the PR professionals sitting in. And you do get, not very often, you do get the interviewing being interrupted by the PR professional saying, well, actually, you shouldn't really say that. That's not something we can say at this time. So there's degree of management in terms of the relationship between the journalist and the company that comes in when PR companies are involved. So it is swings and roundabouts from a journalistic point of view. I think from a company point of view, if you can afford it, using not even an expensive PR company, but a PR company that knows what it's doing, can save you a lot of time and can save you a lot of mistakes as well, because it's a little bit like sort of outsourcing your accounts or something like that. You can sort of pass the headache of managing journalists over to somebody who kind of knows how to do it, as opposed to spending an awful lot of time doing it yourself. And it obviously is cheaper to do it yourself. But I have to say the pitches that tend to start along the lines of, hey, I've got a great company, will you write about me? Which aren't helpful, don't come from PR companies. They come direct from businesses, because, and I don't want to generalize here, but if you run a business, you think it's the most important thing in the world. I mean, I run a freelance business, and I think for me, it's the most important thing in the world. So it's not a criticism. And you don't necessarily think, there are 200 other great companies that are writing to this journalist this week, and you don't necessarily think, I've got to give the journalist a reason to write about my company. Whereas a PR company will think all that through for you, and they will come up with a strategy if they're a good PR company, and they will do more than just send press releases. They will build the relationships. So if you are going to do it yourself, I think it's just well worth remembering, going back to the point that I made at the beginning. It's not a problem. I don't mind at all being called by companies without a PR involved. I quite like it, actually. But remember that what you're pitching is not the journalist. You want your company to get coverage. The journalist wants to find interesting stories. So you've got to really think in terms of, why does my company's story interest this particular journalist? And as I say, PR companies will do that sort of thinking for you. But I think if you're going to do it yourself, and there's every economic reason why you should do it yourself, that's what you really need to think in terms of, what is interesting about my company that is going to be of interest to that publication or that journalist. And if you can think in those terms, I think there's, and you're prepared to put the time in, or have somebody on the staff who puts the time in, there's no reason why you have to use a PR company, but it can be helpful.
Mm-hmm. And Trevor, you mentioned already a few times how to get prepared, how to make research, etc. But before we finish this interview, can you please give some maybe example, or well, I don't want to make you think in templates, but example of email or pitch from early stage startup who is not yet Tesla founder, etc. What will trigger your attention? What kind of style of communication, more friendly, unusual, slang, whatever, or what can piss you off?
Let's start with what triggers my attention. There is no one thing. I think it's always good to have a subject header on the email that is interesting, and that if you like tells the story that you want to tell in 10 words or something, or whatever fits on the subject header, because that's the first thing that you see. Does it sound interesting? In an ideal world, once I open that email up, I would like to feel that it's always one helpful thing, because it's kind of flattering, even though you can take it with a certain pinch of salt. If somebody said, "Well, I've just read your article on Forbes, or I've just read your article in IDG Connect," and I thought the points you made were interesting, and we're working in a similar field and we've done something similar. Would you like to hear more? And that's always a good way to start if you get the feeling that the person in question knows something about your work as a journalist. I think from a startup point of view, it is difficult, because particularly if they're at the stage where they're still under the radar, as it were, but where they haven't come out, because there are all these ideas bouncing around in the office about what a great company it is and how great the ideas are, but none of those ideas have sort of seeped out to the world outside, and that's obviously what they want to do. And there's no validation as yet about that. And that's really hard for a journalist, because if you get somebody, even if it's a really wonderful business model, which actually is interesting, you need some sort of validation. So it is hard for startups. So maybe you should think of the news agenda. Maybe you should think of and it goes back to that. Not even the news agenda, but a topic that's something I've written, for example, quite a lot about accelerators, how they work, and hackathons, or corporate innovation programs. Those are sort of subject articles, and they are of interest. So if you've taken part in one of those, for example, if you've been part of the Y Combinator, or whatever, it's kind of big news if you're a startup, that would make me sit up and look. Or if you were example I think I might have used when we spoke before the interview, but if you're a company that is marketing products mainly aimed at women, but you've had trouble raising funding from mainly male VCs, then that kind of story is interesting as well. I don't have to really think about whether you've validated your business model or not. What I've got there is a story about someone with a really good idea who's tried pitching it and actually, at the end of the day, has raised money from angels rather than VCs, because the VCs were male dominated and they didn't really get it. And that, I might not profile the company, but what I might do is use 3 examples of that in a feature, about how it can be difficult. Sometimes VCs just don't get it. They don't get ideas that are. And it might not be a male-female thing. It might be, an African entrepreneur pitching to VCs who don't really understand the dynamics of a particular market in Africa, and that's kind of interesting. So I problem with startups, to sum up, is that very often their product isn't validated. The big thing that I'd be interested in is they usually all have really good stories, some about overcoming adversity, about getting onto an accelerator, or what it's like to win a business award at an early stage. And these aren't necessarily company profiles, but they're stories that other entrepreneurs or people interested in entrepreneurship will read. They might not be interested in company X, but they will be interested if company X has just won a business award, and as a result of winning that award, they've got twice as many orders as they had before. So I in short, I think what really interests me is the entrepreneurial story. Also, maybe if the idea is just so good and so disruptive and so wow, nobody's ever thought of that before, I'll cover that as well. I don't really mind if they don't have any revenues at that stage. I'll just think, well, it's just a really, really good idea. But mainly it's the entrepreneur story. It's the journey they've taken and what that journey says about their company, what it can say to other people, say reading the Forbes entrepreneur channel, who I assume are mainly entrepreneurs, angels, VCs, and the like. So tell me a good story in a way. Don't tell me we've got a great company and we're going to go places. Tell me what your story is and why it's of interest to others.
Mm-hmm. But you can't put it in the press release or in the introductory message.
You can, I think, you can definitely put it in the message. Partly that's down to, again, a little bit down to research. Actually, if for example, I had written something about breaking the US market, if you're a European company and breaking the US market and having to set up a headquarters in San Francisco when you were actually headquartered in Berlin before, but the backers said you had to, or Barcelona, but the backers said you had to sort of set up your HQ in the Bay Area. So I've written that story, but if somebody might get in touch with Pitch and say, well, actually, read that was really interesting. What we've just actually been on a trade mission to China, and it's really difficult. Are you at all interested in what it's like for a startup company to break into the Chinese market? What the difficulties are? I might well say, yeah, that's a great idea. And then after that, you can say what the company does, but the story is up there at the top, and it's a story that I can pick up on.
Your angle is very interesting. It means that you are not exactly or necessarily looking at what is unique in the startup, but you are looking what makes it similar to a lot of other entrepreneurs, like similar problems, similar challenges, etc.
That can definitely be a way forward. I think, because you could divide up. I guess if you what are readers looking from a story, and if you say some readers are investors, so they will actually be interested in what's unique about the startup. Other readers will be startup founders who have an interest in what other entrepreneurs are doing. They might not be so interested in the unique product produced by, say, a tech startup, but what they might well be interested in is the universal experience and how you do it, how you break into a new market, how you fund a company if VCs aren't interested, but you think they should be. You think they just don't get what you do. What you do as a company when it gets to the stage that you're about to start scaling up really rapidly, and as a founder, you're a technician or a scientist. Do you carry on as CEO, or do you bring in another CEO? All those aspects I think, are really interesting to fellow entrepreneurs. Investors maybe want to know about the unique proposition. Potential customers possibly want to know about the unique proposition as well. So it's a variety of things. So I would say very few propositions are absolutely unique, to be honest. Very often you do get press release from people saying this is the first offering of its kind in the world. And yeah, sort of, but there are very similar things as well. So if something does strike me as absolutely unique, so groundbreaking, really disruptive, I will write about that, and I don't care if they've just started or if they're if it's interesting, I'll write about it. So the unique side I am interested in. Then there are other companies. If you run a market, if you run an online marketplace, and there are lots and lots of companies do that in different sectors, that's not unique. But maybe what makes it unique is how you approach it as an entrepreneur and the journey you've taken and the decisions you make, and how your decisions have differed from other people's decisions. Has that contributed to your success? Has that contributed to lack of success? Very few people want to talk about that. So again, there's no cast iron rule. Again, if I was to break it down to a nutshell, I'm kind of looking for either a good entrepreneurial story or a really, really, really genuinely groundbreaking idea or a groundbreaking bit of technology. I have to do a bit more due diligence on the groundbreaking technology because just to make sure it is really. But I would sum it up in those two areas.
Awesome. That is a very good answer for this question. And just to summarize, guys who are watching us now, first, in a nutshell, what Trevor said is prepare your homework and make research before approaching journalists. Second, it's about the human behavior and human relationship, not about just pitching and being listened and featured by journalists. And third, polish your pitch, think it over. It is two-way road, and really, if you want to make it good, if you want to be featured in Forbes, you can be featured even being on an early startup stage without million of revenues in your account yet. But to be featured in Forbes by journalists like Trevor, who is writing stories, you should think over your story and not just copy-paste the typical press releases or templates advised by different marketing guys. So that is a really thoughtful advice and discussion. And Trevor, I'm so grateful for you, for your time and willingness to share your experience. I hope it will help a lot of entrepreneurs.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been an experience to be interviewed rather than to be the interviewer. So that's been kind of fun.
I hope you will like the final version. And now I have a chance on the next meetings to say, oh, I just had an interview with Forbes journalist, and it will sound really cool without mentioning who took an interview from whom. Thanks so much, Trevor. I wish you this year to have amazing stories in your media magazines, and finally to get Pulitzer Prize if they give for startup stories.
I'll look forward to that myself. And again, thank you for having me.